You'll see you'll see the participant number start to skyrocket down below, like where the poll options are. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes. Just want to let everybody have an opportunity to log in, and then we'll get started. I'll actually start putting into the chat some of the updates that we have that we want to share with you guys. And happy St. Patrick's Day to everybody. I almost forgot. That is today, right?
Yeah, Meghana wore green, so she's reminding us.
My daughter reminded me to wear green, so I am wearing green.
Good call. Good call. Hope everybody's wearing some green. Okay. Okay, I will go ahead and start. I want to drop in. I'm going to be putting the notes in the chat window. Oh, I like that. See the shamrock? Cool. Okay, for everybody, the April meeting will be a collaborative event that ISACA San Diego is doing with IAPP San Diego as well. It'll be a panel-driven event, reviewing the ISACA Corporate Privacy and Practice Survey that came out earlier this year. And it'll be panel-driven. And so here is a link that you can register to that. What we do need to tell everybody is normally we track registrations on these so we can send out for the CPE credit, but because IAPP has it set up as privacy professionals, that there is no registration. So the link's available there, but we won't be sending out the CPEs because we won't be knowing who's attending. We just need you to track it on your own. And if you have any questions or anything, reach out to us and we'll be happy to help. But that is the link for that. Another event that is coming up that is on the calendar that is available for free for everyone. It's a virtual summit. If you attend this one, it is, I think, eligible for 7 CPEs that you can get from it. And then another event that actually just came our way yesterday. It's not even on the calendar yet, but we do have the registration, and I'm going to drop that one in here. This one is March 31st. It'll be at the Westin San Diego Gas Lamp, in Gas Lamp. And if you can attend this one at no cost using the discount code that's in the chat there, which is $195 savings. And if you attend this one, you are eligible for 8 CPEs. So that is there. I do want to let everybody know that probably starting in June, we're going to be opening up the meetings to be on premise and look to broadcast them live as well. So keep an eye out for that. We'll be back at the Amazon facilities. So we get a chance to start seeing each other in person. Hopefully, one thing that we were working on yesterday or last month, we got to figure it out. The closed captioning is running now, so everybody should be seeing that. And what else? It is not on the calendar yet, but the May meeting will be a presentation by 120 VC. They presented a couple of years ago, and the topic is on project management. They're going to squeeze a 90-minute presentation into the hour that we get. And, okay, so thanks, Dorothy. 6 CPs for interface. But what they're offering is we're squeezing the 90-minute presentation into 60 minutes, And they also have a 6-hour workshop that'll be available on a separate date. And the cost for that 6-hour workshop is normally $225 for anybody that's interested, that's an ISACA member. Our chapter is covering half of the cost. So you can access that for $112, and we'll get the information up on that one to make available for you. If anybody has any questions, just please post them in the chat. And same as through the presentation. As always, we want to make these interactive, get any questions answered. And if anybody else has any comments or suggestions or recommendations, even links or anything, please drop them in the chat so we can share what we, so everybody can see them. And Terry, for the one in May, I don't have the link yet. I apologize. We'll be getting it up on the chapter's website in the next day or two. And once we have it up, we'll also be sending out an email blast and everything. So I did drop in links to all the ones that we have, but we'll get the May event up on the calendar. So with that, it's Aparna and I have the pleasure to introduce this month's presenter. We have Meghana Jagdish from Illumina, and we've already given her the power to be hostmaster of this event. So what I'd like to do is hand the microphone over to you, let you introduce yourself to everybody, and very much look forward to hearing what you have to share.
Thanks, Dave. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me just see if, can you guys all see my screen? Yes, perfect.
Yes.
So my name is Meghana Jagdish. I'm excited to be here, so thanks for having me. Right now, I am a director of internal audit at Illumina, but prior to that, spent pretty much most of my career in the risk management space. So today, I'm super excited to be talking to you guys about, what do we mean by risk management? Why is risk management important? And depending on where you are, within the organization, what is your role? Risk management can be a little bit of a dry topic, so let's try to make this as interactive as possible. Like Dave said, use the chat functionality, the Q&A functionality. We have introduced sort of polling, so we will try that technology out as well. But again, chime in with comments, questions, and Dave will stop me since I'm on full screen mode. So we'll start with stories because I like to weave in stories into the presentation to make it something more tangible. So when we think about, so this was an event that happened, I think about just pre-pandemic, related to a Microsoft software engineer. So this software engineer was trusted with test accounts to sort of test the Microsoft's e-commerce operations to identify any glitches and really robustly test this application. So while he was doing that, he noticed a glitch and decided to abuse the system. And what happened was he was able to recover like these 25 code digital, those digital gift cards that we all use. And it was initially started off with just $5 and $10, and then realized that he can pretty much abuse the system without anyone being able to notice it. And over a span of a couple of months, he stole over $10 million worth of gift cards and then sold them online to a third party, just, to such that folks can use that to buy like Xbox, et cetera, games online. Not only did he use his own account, but through mechanisms, he was able to use test email accounts of other Microsoft, testers and, conduct this fraud. So the way it was flagged was, Microsoft software engineer. So, not too bad of a salary, but they saw this sudden change in his lifestyle where he was able to purchase a Tesla, which we all know how expensive those can get. And then not only that, he bought a $1.7 million lakefront home in Seattle. So what was the impact? Definitely once Microsoft found out about it, he was fired from Microsoft. I think just recently, there was a court hearing just a couple months ago, and he was sentenced to 9 years in prison. And he's paying a fine of $8.3 million, much more than, or almost equal to the amounts that he made. And not only that, the catch was he not only put himself in jeopardy, but he also used the accounts of other employees, subjecting them to also be charged. So Microsoft, I'm sure all of you are thinking, Microsoft's such a smart company. So what happened? We'll come to that in a second. So before I get to what happened, wanted a level set on what is meant by risk. And this is the official definition, which is it's a threat that an event or an action will affect the organization's ability to achieve its business objectives. So something that will hinder us from achieving our business objectives. In simple terms, the way to sort of simplify that language is it's basically the what could go wrong, right? Or if you want to put the positive spin on it, it's what must be improved in order for us to meet our company's goals and objectives. So coming back to that Microsoft story, Microsoft's, again, a smart company. They did think about sort of the risk. They applied that risk mindset, and they said, we're going to prevent these testers from generating physical gift cards. That was just half the scenario, though. They missed the second half to restrict these testers from, being able to generate those digital codes. And it cost them a lot, $10 million worth. So why is risk management important? And this is not in any particular order, but when I think about risk management, first and foremost, it protects the company's assets. And when we talk about assets, it's not just the physical property or the laptops or the servers, but also people and soft assets such as intellectual property, which, for a company like Illumina, that's very important. Helps achieve companies' objectives. A successful risk management program provides you with all the facts that you need to help make those smart decisions. So ultimately, all the things that could impede you from achieving your company's objectives. Ensures compliance with laws and regulations. For those of you who work in a public company, you're probably very familiar with the Sarbanes-Oxley, which came into play after the Enron and the Tyco financial fraud incident. But then in addition to that, there's various other laws and regulations, like for those in the healthcare, with PHI, the protected health information, there's HIPAA. For those that deal with personal identifiable information, there's GDPR or the California CCPA. So there's a lot, and risk management helps ensure we're in compliance with those applicable laws and regulations. It promotes companies' reputation. And what I mean by that is when your company is in the news, in the headlines, for the wrong reason. So like we saw with Microsoft, or we hear about when there's a cybersecurity breach because of something that the company could have prevented. Or when you think about public companies that issue 10Ks, when there's a material weakness, which is again a SOX terminology, it ultimately impacts the company's reputation and the stockholder price. And we'll see stories, that we've all heard of in the news, which hit on these two elements of company's reputation being impacted and then the shareholder value also being impacted. This next one I want to spend a minute on is provides risk-taking opportunities. So whenever we think of risk, we usually think of it in that negative connotation, right? But there's a positive or an upside to risk. And that's basically, are we taking too little risk? And that's where the opportunity piece comes in. So depending on your company's tolerance, your appetite for risk, that can turn into an opportunity to be like, I have the opportunity to take more risk. And so that's the positive side of it. And then we talked about helps with decision making because you have all the facts that you see. So risk management is especially important in the times of uncertainties, in the uncertainty that we live in right now. So rather than relying on, sort of good luck and hoping and praying for the best, being proactive about risk management will not only save time, money, but also enhance your company's reputation.
Meghana,
Yes.
we do have a comment from David, and it said the why is risk management slide is very company centric. There should be a silo for protecting customer data above and beyond reputational risk.
Completely. I completely agree with that, David, and thanks for that comment. It's not just company data, but it's also reputation from who you do business with, in terms of your suppliers, your customers, and also the people that work within the organization. So great point. Thanks for that.
Cool. Yes, thanks, David. Thank you.
So now that we've talked about, what is risk management? Why is risk management important? I'm sure you're all excited to be like, okay, how do I go about doing this if you're not already doing this, right? The first thing to start with is what's your objective? And David hit on it a little bit, is your objective to do risk management at an organizational level? Is it to do it in the particular process or department that you work in? Or if it's a project that you're working on, whether that be a process reengineering or an IT sort of system implementation, what is that objective? And that sets the context. And after that, you go through this cyclical process. So we'll start with, identify. So the identification is, what's getting in my way of accomplishing that specific objective? In the assess, you almost, once you have that identification of risk, you prioritize the risks and you say, of these, which ones are more likely to occur? And if they were to occur, what's the impact when it occurs? And this is a very important step because, again, going back to your objectives, all risks identified may not impact your objective. And so this assessment piece to really prioritize the right risk is important. Then we get into the respond. So, now that I know what are the risks and I've assessed them, what do I do about it? And when we think about response, there's multiple ways in which you can tackle this. First one is you avoid it entirely, right? And that's rare unless you change your strategy to achieve that specific objective. The second one is you accept the risk. So again, depending on your tolerance level, you could say the likelihood and the impact of this is not catastrophic to my objective. And so this may be an option where you accept the risk and you don't take any specific actions. The third is you mitigate that risk, and which is where we typically see a lot of, especially at the organizational level, or even at the project level, that's where we typically see that mitigation. And what we mean by mitigation is you minimize the likelihood or the impact that risk can have. And we'll get to more in terms of that mitigation when we talk about internal controls here in a few minutes. And then the fourth element is transfer. So where you're transferring that liability or the cost or the impact of that risk to a third party. And this could be like when you hear of companies taking property insurance or cybersecurity insurance, that's what transfer is, where you're transferring that risk through the purchase of an insurance. So after you've determined sort of what I'm going to do about it, the fourth element is monitor, where you almost do this sort of look back to say, is my response, whatever mechanism I chose, is it working as intended? Is there something that I need to fine tune, right? Do the metrics that you're tracking, that you're monitoring, indicate a need for you to go back and change your response procedures. The key in determining, one thing I forgot to mention, the key in determining the right response is that balance between the risk versus reward. You want to be able to make sure that that balance is there, because otherwise it's not an appropriate response procedure. And this is the reason why it's a cyclical, you see the arrows, is because it's not a one-time process. It's an ongoing process. And what we recommend is, especially when you have either new folks coming on your team, or if there's changes in your processes, or if there's a new technology, so that people process technology piece. And just the more you do it, the better it is. So I know this was a very theoretical concept, so let's try to personalize it by taking a personal example. So say our objective, I live in San Diego, and I think most of you guys on the phone are from San Diego. The objective is to protect our personal property, right? When we go through this cyclical process, we identify and we say, in San Diego, there's a high risk of fires, especially during the Santa Ana period, right? So we assess that risk and we say, compared to tornadoes, the risk of fires, especially during Santa Ana, the likelihood of a fire occurring is pretty high. And the impact, your house could burn down, is pretty high as well. So you assess it and you say, when you take the probability of a tornado versus a fire, the likelihood that a fire will occur is probably higher, and the impact when it occurs is higher for those in San Diego. The third step is response. So let's go through the 4 mechanisms that I talked about when we talk about response. So avoid. You probably have to move out of San Diego, which is not very likely. Accept. If you're a millionaire, you can probably live with the fact that, I'm going to take that risk and wait for this event to occur. Again, not very likely, at least in my case. Transfer. So you transfer by purchasing fire insurance, which most of us have, right? And then in addition to that, so transfer takes care of portion of the risk or portion of the impact. In addition to that, you mitigate through the mechanism of fire extinguishers, you have an evacuation plan, et cetera. So those are your mitigation mechanisms. Now, again, going back to that risk versus reward, one of the mitigations could be you could have a fire truck parked outside. But again, that's not practical, that's not feasible, that's not cost efficient, right? And so again, the risk versus reward conversation comes in here. Go to the 4th step, which is monitor, and then you monitor your response. So you have all these fancy technologies coming out with Ring being able to, tell you on your phone if there's the smoke in your house or if there's smoke around you, et cetera. So you monitor and you say, I have fire extinguishers, but maybe I need to add in fire sprinklers, or I need to get this Ring system. And I think you guys get the point. And then you just continue on. So I wanted to make that a bit more tangible by providing you a more personal sort of exercise where you apply these 4 mechanisms. So time for a poll, and I am going to try to do this 1 second. So I want to hear from you guys, whether that be, again, in your organization, in your process, in your project, what are some of the mechanisms you use to identify risks? So and none of this, all of these are good answers. So surveys, questionnaires, periodic annual risk assessments, tabletop or simulation exercises, vulnerability assessments, a lot of you in that IT and security space. And then if there's any others, would love to hear it in the chat function, if there's other mechanisms that you guys use. And I'll give it a minute before we end the poll.
And the poll is set up that you can select more than one option.
Thanks, Dave. Yep. 5 more seconds and perfect. And I will share the results. Can you guys see the results? Just want to make sure.
Yes.
Perfect. So it looks like majority of you do this periodic risk assessment. If you want in the chat functionality, it'd be good for us to sort of share, how often do you guys do this? Do you do this quarterly? Do you do this annually? At Illumina, we've just implemented an enterprise risk management system. So we do this more on a quarterly basis, but would love to hear what the peers are doing as well. And then it looks like the second runner-up is vulnerability assessment, which I expected, just knowing a lot of the security professionals in the room. So
yeah, I'm curious to see what the other option is other than the top 4.
Yeah, can you see the chat, Aparna?
Yes, I do. Yeah, it's quarterly, annual, and other responses, periodic meetings with management to learn about changes, strategies.
That's great.
Yeah, and from over here, because as a panelist, I can't vote. But from a security side, a lot of our vulnerability assessments that we do annually.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And those are technical vulnerability assessments, right, Dave?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. And what we'll do is with the client, we'll do them annually, and then you can start to show what level of maturity and progress or lack of progress that the organization's making.
And that gets to that monitoring piece, right? Not only do you identify it, but then you monitor it to make sure there's been progress.
Exactly.
That's great. Awesome. Hold on. Okay. So remember I talked. Sorry, go ahead, Dave.
Comments if you want to share those, Aparna.
Yeah, it looks like Stephen mentioned that we have security review at SDLC milestones during CCB. We review all the items on the release plan, pretty similar to what used to be Illumina here.
Right, yeah, and that's a great practice, right? Before something goes into your production environment, reviewing it for that risk lens. So thanks, Stephen. So moving along, so what are internal controls? So if you guys remember when I talked about that mitigation, when it comes to that response, by formal definition, internal controls are actions taken to enhance the likelihood, that your objectives again would be met, or reduce that likelihood of that risk manifesting. And when we talk about controls, it's policies, procedures, setting expectations, even the tone at the top of the organization. And then in that San Diego sort of fire example, fire extinguisher, the evacuation plan, those were all internal controls. In the professional world, all of us need to get our expenses approved or raise a PO before we have some services rendered, right? Those are all, again, internal controls. One thing I'd like to highlight, because, risk management seems to still be a concept that people are scared of, right? And internal controls should be part and parcel of your business. It's not this additional thing that you do after you've done your day job. So building that sort of mechanism in is great. So what happens when you ignore internal controls? And what we call this is, it's the fraud triangle. So whenever you ignore internal controls or don't have appropriate internal controls, the opportunity for fraud arises. And this could be, theft, embezzlement, etc. So the fraud triangle, some interesting facts. The fraud triangle was created by a criminologist. I think his name was Donald Cressy, who actually interviewed different inmates in prison to sort of, and then come up with these 3 sort of factors need to be present in order for fraud to occur. So I'll go through all of them. So the first one is pressure. And when we think of pressure, it's also called motivation. And this is your reason to commit fraud. And this could be personal or financial pressures. It could be this gambling addiction. It could be just the, the interest to have a lavish lifestyle. And so that's what the first thing is. You need to have that pressure, that motivation. Second comes the opportunity on this side here. Opportunity is the ability to create fraud. And opportunity comes in when you have either lack or weak internal controls, or you don't have those extra pair of eyes. So senior management is not watching. So it allows the person who wants to do the fraud, the perpetrator, to get away with it. And then the third piece is that rationalization. So after you've had the pressure, you've taken advantage of the opportunity, is the rationalization. It's almost that justification to say, it's fine, it's just a loan, I will pay it back. I've worked really hard hours, I sort of deserve it, right? So we do not have control over a person's pressure or rationalization. Where all of us, in our organization can make a difference or prevent fraud or limit fraud is that opportunity piece, which is where internal controls comes in, those policies, those practices, those review mechanisms, those approvals, right? So there was a report by Report of Nations where they mentioned that, and this was, I think, 2020, and they looked at all the fraud across the world, and they said the top 3 reasons why fraud tends to occur is lack of internal controls, override of internal controls, or lack of management review. So just recently, I saw this Netflix documentary. I don't know how many of you have seen it, The Dropout, based off of Theranos Elizabeth Holmes. And I'd highly recommend you guys to watch it. And for those of you who haven't, you have some weekend watching to do. And so when you go through that documentary or series, not a documentary, you'll see these 3 elements at play. So from a pressure perspective, or that motivation was, she was scared of needles, right? And she had this drive to become famous and wealthy. The opportunity was, there was no separation of powers. She was the ultimate decision-making in pretty much anything and everything that happened at the company. There were no checks and balances. There wasn't corporate governance. And her rationalization was, I'm doing this for the broader humankind. This will help individuals who are scared of needles, et cetera. Especially in times of uncertainty that we live in right now, with the pandemic or the endemic, I think now, as well as, all that we see in the world with the Russia, Ukraine, and inflation and everything. It's important for us to be more vigilant and more attentive to fraud. And again, the only way we can control that is through that opportunity mechanism by implementing and enforcing good internal controls. So who is responsible for risk management? So this was the 3 lines model published by the Institute of Internal Auditors. I'll go through this at a very high level, but then we have some examples which will make it more tangible for you guys. So at the top, you see it's the governance body, which, in a lot of cases is the audit committee or the board of directors. In the bottom left, you see under management, you have the first and second line, right? And the way this first and second line, it's not distinguished by sort of where you sit within the organization, what your title is, but more in terms of the activity that you perform. So the first line are those that provide products, services. So they're more of the doers, right? The second line is they're the monitors. They have these expertise. They can challenge you on risk-related matters. And so that constitutes management, the first and the second line. The third line is where internal audit comes in, and we provide, that independent and objective assurance to the board to say, whatever controls or whatever mechanisms management has identified to manage risk, we can provide you that independent assurance that it's working as intended, right? Now, the arrows that you see are very intentional because even though there are 3 lines, the alignment, the communication, the coordination between these groups are very important. And when the 3 lines work together, they can improve an organization's risk management structure. And I know that was a lot of theory, so we will go into an example here, a couple of examples to sort of show what happens when the 3 lines fail. So the first one is Wells Fargo. So a lot of you remember this, and when I was reading about this in the news, it's still continuing. So a couple of years after it was initially identified. So what happened is employees boosted sales figures, right, by covertly opening $1.5 million accounts with the million accounts and funding them from other consumer accounts without the customer's knowledge or consent. And this was because of the sales pressure to say, we need to go out there, we need to be in the market. And the clients started identifying this when they started seeing these unanticipated charges, or they saw that, you know, they had credit cards that were being issued, or they saw their credit history. Where the 3 lines failed, right? Wrong tone at the top, because the execs didn't care how the sales target was met. They just wanted more customers. Lack of accountability between the sales org peers. So if you remember that first line, the doers that were going out and getting these accounts, it was lack of accountability. You know, if someone saw something wrong, they didn't speak up, right? And we have this, we use this a lot at Illumina as well, is when it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. So you need to speak up, and they did not. The second line is that corporate risk management function. Those that were the monitors, those checkers, they didn't identify the risks either. They didn't see that we had, or Wells Fargo had, all of these unauthorized accounts. And then it wasn't caught as part of the internal or external auditor testing. Going back to, you know, why risk management is important, there's always a catch, right? It impacted their stock performance. And Wells Fargo was fined about $1 billion in fines. And not only that, you know, they had to commit to the SEC that they will change their sales practices, which required a lot of investment, both time and money, in order to institute new practices, new policies, and add that internal oversight mechanism. So we'll go through another example, and I want this to be interactive, so I'll set the stage here. So this is the hashtag Dieselgate. I think you guys have heard of it. Primarily coined for Volkswagen, the car, where they installed this defeat device software to keep the nitrogen oxide emission levels within legal limits during testing. But then when the car went out on the road, it was 40 times higher. And so this violated federal emission laws. And I think there were a couple of other German automobile companies. The funny thing is, when I was preparing for this presentation just last week, there was another car company, the Toyota Hino trucks, and this is just very recent, March 7th, where they too, I think it was the SEC, found that they were also doing something similar. So this is still ongoing. So going back to the 3 lines model, where do you think the 3 lines failed? And if you guys can use the chat functionality to provide your comments, that'd be great. And I like that, Raul. You're right. You know, the best approach is to combine all the different mechanisms we talked about in the last polling question.
And while we have some people posting in the chat, we do have a question, if I can run that by you real quick.
Yeah, go for it.
And the question is, what are some frameworks that you recommend folks use as resources to get started on risk management efforts?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. There's various mechanisms. You know, a couple that come to mind is COSO came out with an enterprise risk management framework. NIST has an enterprise risk management framework. ISO, I think 31000 is another framework that folks use. One thing I do say is you can use those as guidelines, but tailor it to your organization, right? The last thing you want is risk management to be a burdensome process And you want it to be tailored to your company's risk culture, but there are definitely frameworks out. Another one that I thought of is the RIMS Institute. So if you just type in the Risk Management Society Institute, they have a website with a lot of helpful information that you can leverage.
That's awesome. And then it's an excellent point on, you don't want to blindly follow a framework.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's really designed to give you a path forward that you can, like you did, exactly like you said, to customize for where your organization's at.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Awesome.
Looks like great responses. Thanks, guys. I appreciate the interaction. So here's what I had. I saw the lack of appropriate tone at the top, lack of accountability amongst the engineering groups. There's about 4 or 5 engineers who are in trial right now because they did see this but didn't speak up. Again, that skepticism. The inspection teams did not highlight this issue. So from a second line perspective, those that are responsible for monitoring, and then the quality auditors also missed this design flaw. And going back to the impact, there was damage to the shareholders. Volkswagen's company lost about 40-45% of its value, and it had to pay the dealers 1.2 billion. They had to cut down on their staff. So again, damage from an employee perspective and reputation perspective. I think they were rated one of the 18th best company, but after this scandal sort of fell down in that radar, more in that 25th to 30th best company. So again, a lot of damage to reputation and shareholder value and your customers. So no session these days is complete without us talking about uncertain times, right? Like we all live, we all lived through it the past 2 years. We're on the tail end of it, hopefully. And then another uncertainty happens with, what's happening in Europe with the Russia-Ukraine, the inflation, et cetera. So there's a lot of evolving, emerging risks. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. This is when I was thinking about what are some of the top risks that we all are facing, irrespective of industry. These are the ones that came to mind. You can probably tailor it more to the industry that you work in. So when we think about cybersecurity, cybersecurity has always been a top risk, continues to be, especially now for certain sectors as a result of that Russia-Ukraine. The cyber hackers are just getting smarter by the day, right? And we see a lot of these ransomware attacks. Supply chain disruptions. We see these shortages in department stores, even when we go grocery shopping. We see that, we see a lot of industries like Apple, Tesla, et cetera, impacted by that chip shortage. And so especially when we were going through the pandemic, and I think to an extent now as well, when the ports were closed and there wasn't a lot of passenger flight traffic, this resulted in a lot of disruption in terms of getting raw materials from one place to another, especially from those APAC countries. Talent, we've all heard about the Great Resignation, right? And I think that's leveled out a little bit, but then now we face another challenge with a lot of us going back into work, and how do we navigate through the hybrid work conditions? So talent definitely continues to be, talent acquisition and retention continues to be an emerging risk topic. The new one to add to our list, never did, at least in my career of 15 years, never seen this pop up before, but inflation pressures, right? We saw the report, I think it was, I forget, the Consumer Protection Index, which was 7.9% at the end of February, which has been the highest in 40 years. And so with inflation pressures, there's risks for companies to consider in terms of their pricing, in terms of the purchasing power of their customers. What does it mean to the lease agreements that they have, debt agreements that they have? So a whole slew of risks that comes from this inflation. And then the last one is ESG, which is environmental social governance. So related to that climate change. And, ESG is a fairly new topic. So, when we talk about ESG, the E is environmental, where it relates to how organizations are thinking about climate change, how they're thinking about pollution and the waste that gets generated. The S is the social piece of it, and that relates to safety and working conditions. Are they engaging with suppliers, in Asian countries where, human rights may not be top of mind? So how are the working conditions, not only within the company, but with folks that they do business with? Governance, G stands for the governance, which is anti-bribery, corruption. How is the executive remuneration, and how is the board diversity? How diverse is the board? So uncertainty is, a constant, feels like more these days than it ever has been, but robust risk management can help you get ahead of it and help companies adapt and thrive. So another polling question for you guys. Let me launch this. So what other emerging risks do you see? And the first one is third-party risk management, which is how do we deal with our suppliers? What are risks that our suppliers are posing to us? Company culture, with a lot of us being remote or hybrid, it's impacting companies' culture. So how are companies thinking about evolving and maturing that culture and keeping folks together? Again, going back to that talent retention piece. Political volatility, we see that a lot these days, domestically as well as internationally, with Russia, Ukraine, NATO, the whole gamut. I won't go into that. And then the regulatory change, right? We see a lot coming out as it relates to ESG. I know SEC is come out with a draft cybersecurity sort of guidance for public companies. So there's a lot changing in that regulatory space. So it looks like, I'll give it another 5 seconds.
And we do have another question while people fill that out.
Yeah, go for it.
What are some barriers to companies successfully implementing risk management?
Yeah, that's a good question, Dave. So I think, in my perspective, the biggest challenge is just lack of resources and lack of communication and coordination, right? And what I mean by that is we're all, feels like, working, 80-hour weeks, and we all are juggling multiple things at the same time. So just having the time to think about it, right? And then two, the coordination, when I say coordination amongst the groups, is just being on the same page to say, this is the risk to our organization or process or project, such that the resources can be appropriately allocated, right? I think that seems to be another big challenge as well.
Yeah, and I think to your point and what you're sharing earlier as well, is I think that kind of can trace back to the 3 lines a model. You'll often find where the challenge came from is a breakdown in that.
Exactly. Yeah, we see that a lot too, Dave. Even when I was with EY prior to Illumina, a lot of the times there's a false notion that risk management belongs to internal audit or to the external auditors, right? But it's not the case. Management owns risk, and all of the auditors can be a sounding board because they have that risk sort of training and risk mindset. But again, ultimately, it's folks on the ground who own and manage and respond to risks. So
yeah.
So it looks like third-party risk management. That's great. It is definitely top of the list. Closely followed by company culture and political volatility, which is interesting as well, and then the regulatory changes. Anything in the chat for the other? Yes, I agree with you, Patricia. Third-party risk management has been a known risk for at least 10 years. I just still feel like there's more that we could be doing, right, in that space. But I completely agree with you. Political and economic volatility, the COVID years drove a lot of change and instability. Yes, definitely. I like that, Mary. Lack of understanding that risk belongs to the business, not IT, not audit. You took the words right out of my mouth. Yes.
Yeah, and Stephen had a good note as well, right up above, financial with more transactions over crypto.
Great. Yeah. Completely. Yeah. Financial with more transactions over crypto. Completely. Yeah. I mean, the digital space, the Bitcoin, the cryptocurrency, it's just ever evolving. I just feel like even though I read up on it a lot, I just feel like by the time I finish reading, something's changed. So it's an ever evolving topic. So there's various forums, you know, Gartner, the Big Four come out with sort of top emerging risks, but this one was, I was at a GAM conference earlier this week, which is for IIA, it's the General Audit Conference, I think. I probably screwed that up in terms of the name, but, and so this was earlier this week, and so they issued this IIA On Risk 2022 risks, and these are the top 12 risks. We touched on a lot of these, so I won't go through this, but, and I've put the link there, and I'll share the slides afterwards, but it has a good read in terms of different industries, what these risk profiles mean, and, you know, what to expect. So now that we've talked a lot about, you know, what is risk management, why is it important, what's your role? Just some thoughts on, you know, how you can enhance your risk culture. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just things that came top of mind for me. Is set the right tone at the top, especially for those in the leadership roles. You know, setting that right tone at the top to say, I encourage, you know, your teams to speak up when something doesn't seem right, to speak up, to point out to those risks. We saw that both in the Wells Fargo as well as the Dieselgate example, that, you know, there was the wrong tone at the top. There was sales pressure, and it was just go, 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 irrespective of the method used in order to achieve the objective. The second is educating the workforce, you know, whether that be in terms of expectations, what are the policies, what are your practices, what are those mechanisms in which you manage controls within your organization, you manage risk within the organization, and apply skepticism. Again, I know I've said this once already, but you know, if it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. So speak up, and it's okay if you know it's a false alarm, but you'd rather be safe than sorry. Align on those guardrails, and we use there's a coin term for this, and it's risk appetite. It's how much risk are we willing to take, whether that be on the at an organizational level, at a process level, or at a project level. And what that'll help do is identify those guardrails, to be like anything within those guardrails is okay, but the minute it goes outside of that, from a likelihood or an impact perspective, you need to raise your hand. We need to escalate it to the powers. Think broader than financial risk. You know, there's this tendency that, especially for those of us in the public companies, that when we think about risk, SOX comes to mind, right? But it's broader than financial risk. There's reputational risk, there's regulatory risk, there's IT risks, and so there's third-party risks. And so just think broader than just those financial risks. And then define those measurable metrics. And what we mean by that is, again, there's a term for this. It's called key risk indicators, or again, key performance indicators, where it's what are those, you know, once you've identified and assessed those risks, what are those triggers? What are those metrics that you are monitoring, which will tell you if your risk is going up or down, whether that be due to internal factors or external drivers, et cetera. Identifying and monitoring, I think Dave mentioned that as well. You know, after you do a vulnerability risk assessment, having those metrics to say, are you where you want it to be, you know, 6 months down the line, et cetera. So defining those measurable metrics are very important. And I'm sure there's more that you guys can add to this list, but this was just, you know, top of mind. One other thing I'll tell you is risk management, you know, to a lot of folks who are not in the risk management space, can feel like it's a burdensome. So whenever you're thinking or broaching the topic of risk management, whether again at your project level, for example, make it less burdensome, make it less administrative, and it should just be a part and parcel of what you do day in, day out. And that's when you will definitely enhance that risk culture and everyone will start thinking about it. I love that example that someone mentioned about the change control board and how they review the risks before changes are migrated into production. That's a great practice, right? Where it's part and parcel of what you're doing before you migrate a change into production. So it would not do justice to my internal audit friends if I didn't talk about internal audit. So there's just one slide here on, what internal audit can and can't do. I would say use your internal audit teams as that sounding board. Again, we are subjected to IIA standards, which does not allow us to compromise on our independence and objectivity. So those in the red color here are roles that we cannot take. So we cannot act as management. We can't take decisions on what's the best risk response. What we can do is provide you that recommendation, provide you that, be that sounding board for you to say, yep, this makes sense or this doesn't, and here ask you those questions. So again, management is ultimately responsible, that first, second line, and the governing body is ultimately the decision maker on, what are the risks and what is the best risk response. But again, use your internal audit team as that sounding board for risk management. So to wrap up, in terms of key takeaways, identify risk and continue to monitor for change. And going back to my comment about people, process, technology, especially when there are changes, when there are new people that come into your organization, when there's new processes that are instituted, as well as when you have a new technology that's implemented. Know your role within the organization. Again, going back to that 3 lines model, know your role. Are you a doer? Are you the monitor? Are you the part of that audit where you're the assurance provider? And make sure that there's coordination, alignment, and communication, because that's the key to building that positive risk culture. And always am of this belief that risk management should be simple. Use those real life stories that we just talked about, because you see that in the news all the time. Like I mentioned to you, that Theranos series that I was watching, it was just showing up. So you see this, you read about this all the time. So make risk management simple, real, and easy to understand. That was it for me. I thank you guys very much. Hope you found this session helpful, and we'll open it up for any comments or questions. Dave?
No, this has been fantastic. And I think, I just lost my chat window. We don't want that. There it is. And I think we're current on questions, but I had one for you. And that is, being the professional that you are in the position and capacity and all the information that you're exposed to. If you were to look in your crystal ball and see where you think things may be going, to kind of have an idea looking forward, would love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I wish I had that crystal ball, Dave. I'd be a millionaire by now, but I don't. But my perspective is, right now we saw that risk assessment is just more on a cadence by cadence. But I think where I see risk management going is integrating all these digital or AI tools to make it more real time, more agile, where and I know some companies are already doing this. There's banks, there's mature companies like Microsoft, et cetera, who've already implemented this technology where it's almost real time monitoring of what's going on in the world through Twitter feeds, social media feeds, et cetera. And then it indicates to you what are the risks that are emerging. But I think that's where we see, at least I hope, risk management will be in a couple of years from now, similar to all the other sort of technology advances that we're seeing, right, in that digital space.
Yeah, and we're saying that's really aligned with what we see from a security perspective.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's just so much going on that it requires that sort of capability to have a grasp on it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, there are also a lot of cloud monitoring, risk management, apps, tools, and vendors nowadays coming into the market. But you need to pick and choose what suits your environment, your landscape, private cloud, public cloud. So there are so many nuances to it. There is technology that can give you all this traffic light monitoring for all the services on the cloud. Yeah.
Yeah, and it goes back, right, Aparna, to that risk versus reward. You know, how much are you willing to invest? Because a lot of these technologies can be expensive. So, you know, thank you guys for the comments. I'm glad you found it helpful. Patricia, I owe you lunch because apparently this is one of your favorites. So thank you guys very much again. I appreciate it. I'm very passionate about risk management, so I'm glad you guys found it helpful.
No, this is fantastic, and your passion shows through and how you share it. And for what somebody was asking, yes, we are recording this, so this will be shared along with a copy of the slide deck. We'll have that up on the website in the next few days to share with everybody. So cool. Well, I think we're right at the hour. So I think this is fantastic. If one last shout, if anybody does have any questions. But I think we're good.
Yep.
And just want to thank everybody for attending. And Meghana, I want to thank you for your time, your experience, knowledge, and sharing it with the group. Thank you.
Thank you guys. Have a good one.
Yeah. Thanks, Meghana.